we said we were just going to dive right in. So I guess I will just start by, let me just read the abstract and then we'll start going over the comments. But I think if I just read the abstract real quick, that'll be a good introduction. So this is the Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system written by Satoshi Nakamoto. The abstract is a purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash would allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through a financial institution. Digital signatures provide part of the solution, but the main benefits are lost if a trusted third party is still required to prevent double spending. We propose a solution to the double spending problem using a peer-to-peer network. The network timestamps transactions by hashing them into an ongoing chain of hash-based proof of work, forming a record that cannot be changed without redoing the proof of work. The longest chain not only serves as proof of the sequence of events witnessed, but proof that it came from the largest pool of CPU power. As long as a majority of CPU power is controlled by the nodes that are not cooperating to attack the network, they'll generate the longest chain and outpace attackers. The network itself requires minimal structure. Messages are broadcast on a best effort basis, and nodes can leave and rejoin the network at will, accepting the longest proof of work chain as proof of what happened while they were gone. There's a lot of information in there, so let's just go with our first comment here.
Should we start to unpack?
Yeah. So it seems we have a developing replacement of the banking industry. So let's first off, let's say Bitcoin is, for anyone that hasn't heard of Bitcoin, where have you been? But Bitcoin is a digital money. It's the first cryptocurrency. So I guess this is your comment. What are you seeing with?
Yeah. So, having spent 30 years around the financial industry, I think this is long overdue, something that can be credible. And I think now that it's been in place, like we've talked about, John, now that it's been in place, it's obvious that there are pitfalls with this. So the euphoria, I think, has come off. The sheen has come off. We now know what we're working with. And I think that gives everybody a better chance to assess it in more real terms. And so that's my comment is yes.
And yeah,
go ahead.
When we should mention that obviously this is the original Bitcoin white paper that came out in 2008. Things are different now. We've learned a lot in 10 years of there being cryptocurrencies, more than 10 years now. But we're doing this overview to start from the beginning about where did Bitcoin come from, and why it came about.
Well, and that it's learning for both of us. And we thought doing this podcast was going to be helpful, not only for us, but for anybody else. So, your interest is trying to put together, hey, I want to do some programming in this space. And I applaud your efforts to try to learn it. So for me, I'm in my second career doing other things. And I think this whole Bitcoin and the entire Ethereum and everybody else that's working in the space it's just in its infancy. It's 10 years old. You think about finance as insurance companies or banking. In its essence, it's hundreds of years old. Specific, it's somewhere in the early 1800s. And so when I think of Bitcoin, I'm like, yeah, we're just getting started.
And I think if you just that it's going to work. Of it as currency in general, not even just banking, but just think of it as currency, then it's thousands of years old.
Yeah, right. Yep. So my little comment here on the right, which people can follow along and they can add their own comments. I know in the show notes, you're going to include how they can do that, but
so we'll add a link so that everybody can access this document and you can add comments to our comments or add new comments. And so that'll be a link in the show notes.
Yeah, and it should help everybody's learning. So we're getting the conversation going and we're both learning. There's things I don't know, but I think this is the future, and I'm wanting to dive in Anyway, so my note, I'll just read it. It seems we have a developing replacement of the banking industry. There's audit companies, for instance, who check programming up front, but still it's the same function as at a bank or financial institution. What I meant by that was like our earlier conversation where we talked about, auditing and doing the work that will be in Ethereum, not specifically Bitcoin, but that it's kind of funny. On the back end, I was involved in a lot of audit work for financial institutions. And when you do it on the back end, you're fixing 100 mistakes people didn't know they were making. This flips that. And yes, you have to audit on the front end before you turn it on. So you know that what you're doing is right up front. And yeah, I mean, I like that. I just intuitively go, so we're going to spend more time planning and thinking than reacting and fixing. So.
Yeah. And so I should say one of my goals with this podcast is that I want to work in Ethereum and I want to work on projects. But I think starting with Bitcoin is, I mean, that's what started it all. So that just makes sense. And a part of something I've learned about myself is just if I can explain a concept to other people, then I probably understand it pretty well. And so there's definitely stuff that we don't understand that we're going to explore in this podcast. But if you want to learn about cryptocurrencies, come join us and we'll all learn together. That's kind of our goal here. And so with sharing the document and the notes.
I was thinking about that today, John. Exactly. Is as people look at this, there's a lot of chatter, and we could be viewed as, oh, what do they know? There's so many people ahead of us. Well, the fact is, because it's so new, we don't know what the end game will finally be. We have a ton of experimenting that's going to happen, and you've already had stories that you've told me about things you've read about where there are mishaps. And I guess the opportunity here is to learn it together, get other people's input, and then start to develop smarter, quicker iterations of new things that are based on fact and detail, because too often we shoot from the hip. And if you go back in time, everybody thought A was the answer in Bitcoin. Oh gosh, maybe that didn't work out. And I know you have stories like that. So do you want to go to the next one, or?
Yeah, absolutely. If we're going to get through this, yeah, we got to. So, all right. So the next,
so I'll read mine because,
sure.
I like to do podcasts without the video sometimes. And so we'll read it. We have learned from lessons. So this is highlighting the party is still required to prevent double spending. So what are we saying? Are part of the solution, but the main benefits are lost if a trusted third party is still required. What they're saying is the hope here is Bitcoin, Ethereum, these things are going to eliminate having to trust a third party, i.e. a bank, an insurance company. And while I think the ultimate end game is true, I think you still have to trust the Bitcoin and the developers and programmers up front. And that's new to me. I didn't think it was going to be that way. When I got started with this in 2015 and 16, just reading and really being a follower, I didn't realize all the problems that it was going to have by itself. So we have learned from lessons that it's not perfect. In fact, forks and other program fixes repair errors that existed when they created a particular system. And so I think,
yeah, and I think
we're now able to say we have a 10-year history and we know it's not perfect either.
Yeah, I think in the beginning, a lot of people thought that blockchain was this magic device that could solve everybody's problems. And
I was in that camp. Yeah.
And while I do think it can solve a ton of problems and just create a ton of innovation, it is not a single magic bullet to solve everything. But solving the double spending problem was a huge thing of Bitcoin. So the double spending problem is with digital currencies, it's incredibly easy to copy any digital file or whatever. So how do you stop, if you're creating a digital currency, how do you stop people from spending that, duplicating that currency? It's similar to how do you stop people from counterfeiting US dollars? Well, you make it hard to recreate the US dollar. There's all sorts of mechanisms that they've put, the different watermarks and everything that they put into the US dollar. And they're constantly changing that as well, which I think is an interesting point because the consensus mechanisms of keeping cryptocurrencies is also changing. So you kind of always have to keep up with people that are trying to attack the network or counterfeit counterfeit US dollars or attack a cryptocurrency.
So you put a comment in, John, and I know, I guess for people out there, when they talk about double spending problem, until I read any of this stuff on Bitcoin, I had never heard that phrase, double spending, because raised in, business degrees and finance and been around it for so long, nobody talks in those terms, double spending, right? So from your perspective, and you being a follower, can you explain what you perceive that to be describing in the abstract?
Yeah, so that would be if you're making, so there's a digital ledger that says I have $100. I'm going to go on to Amazon and purchase something for $100. But then I'm going to go on eBay and spend $100. And I'm going to send those transactions at the same time. They both look at the ledger and say, oh, yeah, he has $100, but I've done it in two different locations at the same time. And so that's an attack vector, is if you create these transactions at the same time, and then the blockchain looks at your ledger and says, oh, yes, he does have $100 in his account. All right, good. But now I've spent it in two locations. And so that's the double spending problem, is essentially, and actually there's a good example down here towards the end.
So Jen is just scrolling and looking in the document, which
Yes.
we'd love other people to follow along.
So it's in bullet point 11, calculations. And I guess this is more saying how they defend against that.
Yeah, that's the definition of a chain. Let's spend a minute so that people can understand it, because this kind of new way of accounting is really, so I'll put it in my own terms,
Sure.
is that the chains are linked together just like you would think of as a chain. And so once you've created one link, and the link might have multiple transactions in it. I didn't understand that for the longest time. I thought each transaction was its own. But so you have this link, and it has chains in it, or transactions, and then the next one starts with the last one. So then you have another bunch of transactions, and then that one finishes, and each of these is defined by the transactions that are in them. That's what makes each one unique, and that they pair themselves sequentially. So you can't remove a link, mess with it. So if you took a link out of a chain.
So what you're describing is called a block. So a block is what is linked together, and inside the block is the transactions.
Yeah, exactly. But why is that better? What is that doing for double spending? Because the way you described the buy from Amazon and eBay at the same time, you used the phrase, that it was going to be done on the blockchain. And I know that's not what you intended, but I just want to make sure that you're clarifying for people that the double spending is the problem that it does fix, or reasonably so, that you can't have those. Because I think that that's key to understanding this. And I think it gets lost because people get excited to invest in something, and that's not necessarily what it is.
Yeah, so my understanding of how that works inside the blockchain is that the first transaction that happens would be included in the block. And so yes, if you were to make two transactions, one after the other, I guess the question there, because blocks take minutes to confirm, it's not seconds or milliseconds. If you were to do two transactions within one block, it would nullify the second transaction. Your first transaction would confirm and say yes, but then the second transaction, even within inside that block, it would say, no, you've already spent that. Um, but that is a good question. I suppose I need to look into more exactly how that works, and I think it actually does explain it in here. Um,
Well, I just know that from my perspective in the transactions that I've dealt with, there is no, there isn't any of that. So let's just take an example. A paycheck gets done incorrectly, and then you issue a new paycheck. There's a whole series of problems with that because you've sent tax money to the IRS, to the state. You don't just, it's not a single transaction. Think of a paycheck and all of the deductions, for instance, healthcare and benefits and yada, yada. Well, that might look like one transaction. And when you go to duplicate it and then you try to fix it, it really gets to be thorny. And so what I like about this Bitcoin, and we're going to get to the Ethereum, and that's the ultimate end game here, is to slow walk this whole conversation. But that you have something that will, because it's focused on not double spending, because it's focused on what's in the block as transactions, that you can't undo, which is what we try to do, like in payroll land or in benefit land or insurance land, is you try to undo it. So I could go into other examples and we'll probably get there someday.
yeah, you can't undo the blockchain, and that's part of how it keeps it secure. And so that's a way to attack it would be trying to change the block, and that I think we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. So
Well, I think that's true too. Yeah.
let's put a pin in that and go to our next comment.
Yeah. Well, this is where we invite people to come and comment on it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And really
I
the
mean,
goal
if
is,
somebody has a super concise answer of
right,
how exactly it stops the double spending within a single block, that's something that I need to look into as well. But I'm pretty sure it just takes the first transaction inside that block and then it nullifies, so you would get a failed transaction. And that's one of the problems with Bitcoin, is that it's slow. Um, People don't use it as a currency to buy stuff because you'd be standing in the store for 10 minutes waiting for the block to confirm that they actually got your money. Um, and,
I've
and that's
not
why
heard it put that way. That's funny. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
like they wouldn't let you walk out of the store because they're like, well, hold on, your your Bitcoin confirmation hasn't come through yet, so I don't know if you've actually paid me. Um, and so that goes on to, Bitcoin now is the narrative is that it's a store of value similar to gold rather than a day-to-day cash that you would use for transactions. But let's get back to our notes, and we'll come back to all of that stuff.
Yeah. Good.
So I think we're on this one. The value is this digital perfection to keep one set of records. And so that's what we're saying with the blocks. And that is what the blockchain is keeping a ledger of transactions.
Yeah. So I put the comment that this will be a great place for things like I lived in healthcare, right? Very complicated transactions that will be simplified enormously. But I think, my comment on that is it has to be broader than a specific service provider. So the reason the adoption hasn't been quick is that the largest of companies, the financial institutions especially, that are targeted to be disrupted, they have the greatest sense of loss. But more importantly, worse than that, is they can't turn their business upside down overnight. And that's what we're asking them to do. That no longer are you siloed. A transaction will pay the claim, will do the insurance piece, will process the payer for the provider all at once. That's unheard of. That's unheard of.
Yeah, and I mean, long term, I don't see how that doesn't end up happening. Like I see it as inevitable, but it's going to take a long time to get there. I don't think a lot of these companies are going to, they're going to try everything to not let it happen. But I think eventually it will happen, and it'll be for the better of everyone. But it has to be done right. Otherwise, there's a lot of a lot of things that can go wrong when you start getting into healthcare, and you have all sorts of not only privacy issues, but these are global blockchains, and then now you're talking about healthcare for specific nations. So it'll be interesting to see how all of that interacts.
Yeah, I can't wait to dig into some of that because I think you have to change. So this is the new work I'm doing around lean and lean thinking and customer is who is really the customer with healthcare, and that will be the paradigm shift that we need to tackle this in a different way. Because right now, what I see is I see all the providers trying to continue their own operations by using Bitcoin, and they're stymied, at least in the conversations or things that I've seen. They're stymied because this doesn't lend itself to that. A particular insurance company or bank isn't going to use this to their own benefit and serve their customers because this is a at least nation state kind of cash. I think it's bigger than that, but anyway.
Yeah, I mean the global. I just saw an article that Japan, I believe, is starting their own central bank digital currency. I know China is working on one. Possibly Russia. I mean, all these major nations are starting to talk about creating their own central bank digital currencies.
Well, if you
Um,
think about currency to begin with, currency was developed to support local economies, and it grew where local meant something. Um, when you traded with somebody within, traveling distance, caveman, I suppose you go back in time, but the broader the application, the more people will use it. So just a niche financial service firm is too narrow an application. I think what I like about Bitcoin is it's global, and I like a lot of the work that's being done because it is global. All the people have benefited from that. Okay, all right, we are killing it.
all right, so let's move on to the next one here. Largest pool of CPU power. So this is where my note is that the longest chain not only serves as the proof of the sequence of events witnessed, but proof that it came from the largest pool of CPU power. And this is where Bitcoin has been criticized as not being green because it's consuming a lot of electricity to run all of the miners that keep the network secure. And that's a valid criticism. My opinion on that is that a lot of the people that are running these mining rigs and systems of mining rigs, most people that are mining Bitcoin now have many mining rigs. It's more of like a factory of miners than just somebody in their basement running off of a computer.
Well, we saw that
But
post, and I think I made reference to it, where BOA said it's using as much energy. It was a criticism of Bitcoin. It's using
oh
as much
yeah,
energy as American Airlines. And I know we chatted about that, like, well, what does that mean? We have every $1 billion uses a lot of energy. And I can tell you for sure, having been in the banking business and insurance, they use a lot of energy too. Global offices and people and staff. And so I fail to see how the comparison is anything other than sort of
I mean,
this.
I think it is a valid criticism because you've created this currency that some people see no value in. They're like, oh, Bitcoin, how can that be valuable? And you are using actual resources to keep it in existence. So I think it's a valid criticism, and that's why a lot of cryptocurrencies are moving towards a proof of stake versus a proof of work. And we'll get into what proof of work means. But proof of stake does not use nearly. In fact, I believe it is 95% less CPU power, and that number is probably wrong, but it's somewhere around there. Significantly less consumption versus a proof of work.
Well, I would
So
love to, put my math brain to work on that at some point if you see something that's
yeah, I have a
valuable
good.
study that actually shows what that actually looks like back in the day, there was an organization I worked for, and to process a single claim was $28. And that wasn't what the bank did with it. That wasn't what the other people related to it did with it. And what we're talking about is Bitcoin would do end to end all of it, or Ethereum. And guys, I don't know, $28 times a lot of transactions, that's a lot of energy.
Right. Yeah. So that's the other thing. A lot of people are comparing the energy consumption to just not doing it and having it not exist, opposed to what energy consumption is used by other
Right.
means. How much does the Federal Reserve and banks, how much energy are they using?
Right.
Probably more than American Airlines.
Well, that's why the comparison is just this like emotional appeal to people. Oh my gosh, it's terrible. I don't know. We'll dig in. All right, you want to do the next one?
Yeah. Let's see. So I guess I'll just read. As long as a majority of CPU power is controlled by nodes that are not cooperating to attack the network, they'll generate the longest chain and outpace attackers. And so that's going with the blocks. So you're doing this proof of work algorithm to complete a block, which has transactions included inside that block, and those blocks are chained together, which creates the blockchain. And then your comment here, it's a guess at this point that this isn't happening or couldn't happen. This would most certainly destroy its future. So 51% attacks. As far as I know, Bitcoin has never successfully been attacked with a 51% attack. Smaller chains, blockchains that have been created, I believe, have. But as far as I know, Bitcoin has never been successfully attacked with a 51% attack. And I'll have to double check. I did a little searching before, and I couldn't find anything. So I'm 99% sure that there's never been a successful 51% attack against Bitcoin.
I guess in the back of my mind was the fail when Ethereum launched. And they had to do the hard fork before they started. Because there was an attack and there was a problem.
Yeah, there's been, I think
here.
the thing they've found is that there are a lot of attack vectors that nobody ever realized would be attack vectors. But the main proof of work, 51% attack is still also a potential, but I don't think it's ever been successfully done. It would be very difficult to do. We'll get into it later. I know there's a comment, but somewhere I know there are people that are concerned that China has, because they have farms, mining farms, and they control a large amount of the hash rate, which is the algorithms that they're doing. So there is concerns that China could potentially at some point complete a 51% attack against Bitcoin. But
I don't think that's a small thing. And I think, putting that as a topic for a complete discussion at some point is relevant. And really it's the dastardly person who wants to do evil that you always have to keep an eye open. And that doesn't, look at Enron, and there's plenty of organizations that have failed miserably because people had ill will. So that's not going to go away.
There will always be a potential threat.
Yeah, who has the resources?
And that's what it goes on to say, that those resources get insanely high, and especially as the price of Bitcoin goes up, it gets even more difficult. But always a possibility.
It'd be fun to have somebody on who really gets that end of it and just figure out, okay, what would it take essentially what you're saying in this is CPU power sounds like electricity, and it's not that at all. It's someone willing to pay the amount of money to recreate the entire Bitcoin ledger all the way back in time, and then they're able to take it over.
It's not even that so much.
Yeah.
It's more about just the most recent block, because to be able to redo the whole thing, then you're just essentially creating your own new blockchain. But if you want to just maliciously change one block, the most recent block, and then you would be able to double spend. Then you could say spend your $1 million 100 times in one block, and then you've just created, $99 million that you didn't have. And all that requires is creating the most recent block and convincing everybody that that is the right block, and that requires 51% of the computing power. So let's get into.
Well, I want to come back to it at some point because, my concern is, and what you and I wanted to do to get into this is really look at the truth and the facts in reality. And I know that anytime you have people that are working on something like this, there's a built-in bias, and I want to remove that. So I want to tell the story of what the bad news is going to be in 5 years ahead of time, so we can all get past that sooner. So,
well, I don't think a 51% attack gets. I think as time goes on, it gets less likely. Um, Especially when we get into Ethereum and we start talking about proof of stake and really the decentralization of nodes. Having more people running nodes is going to be better for the network. So an example for Bitcoin, if you have China running, their government is running mining farms and they're owning a lot of this computing power, that's centralization. Whereas if anybody can run a node, then you have millions or billions of nodes running all across the world. Then everybody owns a little piece, which is going to be better for decentralization as well as security. Bitcoin, the computing power, what they use now are called ASIC miners, which is application specific integrated chip. ASIC, yeah. And so basically all it's designed to run this Bitcoin mining formula, and that's all it does. So people that are running these farms have farms of these ASIC miners, and pretty much any other computer can't keep up with those. So if you want to mine Bitcoin, you need to buy one of these ASIC miners. And this, I'm gonna jump forward because
yeah.
Let's talk about what this cryptographic proof actually is that these miners are doing. So cryptographic proofs are their own study of cryptography, and I think that deserves its own episode. But we can kind of quickly go over. So here from Wikipedia, what is a cryptographic? And this is a zero knowledge proof, which is slightly different. But in cryptography, a zero knowledge proof or zero knowledge protocol is a method by which one party can prove to another party that they know a value X without conveying any information apart from the fact that they know the value of X. And how they do that is with cryptographic hash functions. So Bitcoin is built on SHA-256, which is the problem that these miners have to solve to create the next block, which then rewards them with Bitcoin. So essentially what they're doing is the message here, this would be the transactions. They go through a hash algorithm, and then it creates the hash value, which is just a string of letters and numbers that seemingly don't mean anything. And this is where is it? So what Bitcoin miners are doing is they're all trying to solve this SHA-256 encryption, for including all the transactions, and then there's this thing called nonce, which that might be getting too much into it, but essentially the crypto miners are trying to solve this equation to get the right answer that comes out with the correct string from this encryption algorithm. And the first miner that completes the correct calculation and the rest of the blocks agree, he's rewarded with a certain amount of Bitcoin. and that's how mining works. So if your miner is the one that completes the calculation, you've added the next block to the blockchain, you're rewarded with Bitcoin, and that takes a lot of computing power.
So what is the algorithm look like? I mean, is that like, what actually is it? Is it pluses and minuses? Is it?
No, so here I can read.
We don't need to get in a lot of detail.
So
is that's something that you have on this page? And
this page is a really good explanation of it. If you read, so it gets into the nonce. The nonce is a big thing with that, and I think there's a really good.
well, it looks like this page is actually walking you through it. Hard luck.
Yeah, this page does a really good explanation. It's just difficult without reading the entire page to go through.
We don't want to sit here and do that much. Can you link that in the show notes so somebody could get it and look at it as well? Because I'd like to do that.
Yes,
because I'm not, I'm a operations guy, and so I'm trying to put my stake around what I can do to contribute to this, the realm. Can we use the
I'll
word
add it here.
realm?
I think I added it in another comment as well, but if not, it is here. And that is yeah, it gives a really good explanation. You may need to read it a couple of times. It's not necessarily easy to understand, but it's not too complicated. Essentially, they are
Well, I
it's kind of
see
like
it.
a trial and error.
Go back up, John, because there's a link right there. It says, try yourself to generate for a text string here.
So that's just using the SHA 256. So, but this is cool. So let's just do, so let's write hello world, and we will generate, see what the hash looks like from, we're running it through this SHA 256 encryption.
And that's that string down below.
Yep. So this is the hash of, and so this, instead of being hello world, this would be a ledger of all the transactions. So this would be, and I don't know what that actually looks like, to be honest, but however they record the transactions to the blockchain. So now this, I've changed something here. This is going to change.
Yeah, exactly. Every time you type something, it changes.
Oh, is it doing it in real time? Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's super cool. This was good. This is a very good catch. So yeah, I mean, I would encourage anybody listening to go play with this because I see the other MD5 must be a thing, SHA-1, SHA-5.
Yeah, and those are all different methods of encryption. And I think the biggest thing to understand about the cryptography is that the goal with how SHA 256 works is whatever the input is always going to give you the same output.
But is it something that you can work backward? If in math, you can work anything backward. If you have the answer and you have one missing variable, is the encryption the kind of thing that you cannot work backward?
That's the goal is, so if I, if I write hello world, this is always going to be the same string of letters and numbers.
But you can't.
But knowing this, you will not be able to get back to.
That's what I was asking.
My initial input, and so that's where private key and public key become really important in having custody of your cryptocurrencies. Knowing your private key, you can give your public key, which is a string, is the hash here, but your private key is like this hello world. So somebody that knows your private key can then steal all of your crypto. But if they know your public key,
I have been lost in that in a day's time when I first bought a crypto. And so explain that when somebody trades this, because I'm assuming that this is going to be Ethereum as well. And when somebody trades this, because this is how people have lost a lot of crypto, is they didn't understand this hash at the bottom, the string. was the definition of who they were. They needed this exactly. That's why I was asking about working it backward. You can't find this out unless you know what your, so you have a private, which is the define of who you are that nobody else could find. And that's used on the blockchain to define who you are. That's because people will ask me, well, if it's all transparent, then why don't they know who you are? Well, because you get this code, my language. And what you're describing here and what you're showing is that there's two parts to this. The transaction gets a code, my words, and you personally get a code. And that's how nobody would know my code unless I gave it to them. And that's where there's fraud involved. And it's the code.
I think we're kind of talking two different things because yes, but as far as privacy goes, you can still, I think people think Bitcoin is more private than it actually is. It is a public ledger. You can see every transaction that's ever happened. And so maybe this is a good time to check out the block explorer. No, actually.
Yeah, do that. It's good timing.
Well, I want to go. I had a comment here.
Well, there's so much to cover. So,
I know.
For those following along at home, we're going to wander a little until we get this organized.